Hello everyone, I'm Gregory Moille from Cardiac's Universals Group, and today I'm going to present you our recent work on ultra-broadband dissipative Kerr soliton microcomb through dual pumping operation. In particular, I'm going to present you this kind of ultra-broadband microcomb where a primary pump generates a primary dissipative Kerr soliton and a secondary pump is used to spectrally translate the comb teeth of the primary comb into new set of idler both at short and long wavelengths. And I'm going to present you that this spectral translation can be explained through fire mixing by scattering, which is a noiseless spectral translation. So first, why are we interested in Chi3 microcomb is because Chi3 microcomb are shown to have a lot of applications, from astrocomb to LiDAR to optical coherence tomography. But at NIST, where the S stands for standard, we actually care mostly on metrology application. So we focused a lot on optical frequency synthesizer and optical atomic clock, which means that we need to fully stabilize the microcomb, both the repetition rate and the frequency carrier offset, which means we need a 1 octave bandwidth. For power consideration, we work on large FSR ring radius to achieve this full octave, which means we work on a small ring resonator of about 23 micron ring radius, integrated in silicon nitride. So how do we get a broadband dissipative Kerr soliton? So like I said, to fully stabilize the dissipative Kerr soliton, we need to measure the carrier envelope offset frequency through a nonlinear interferometer through F2F. The issue with dissipative Kerr soliton is the frequency of interest at F and 2F are usually small power, and we cannot really get any efficient billing to stabilize it. Recently, it has been demonstrated that using higher order dispersion coefficient, we can locally improve the power of the comb teeth through dispersive waves. And a useful tool to engineer such dispersive wave position is through the integrity dispersion, which is the sum of all the dispersion coefficient without the first one, which is the repetition rate. And by doing some quick math, one can finally find out that the integrated dispersion is roughly the resonance frequency of the resonator minus the dissipative Kerr soliton comb teeth, which are on a fixed grid. And that's quite important to remind this formula for the rest of the talk. But dispersive waves, although they are great and can improve by tens of dB locally the comb teeth power, they're still tens of dB lower than the peak of the comb and 20 to 40 dB lower than the pump. And even with the best second harmonic generation efficiency, we're still at too much low power to efficiently get any FCEO. So a useful tool is actually to introduce another laser which can have a really large power, and we actually lock it to the frequency comb externally. But instead of using it externally, once we have generated the frequency comb, can we instead send it directly to the resonator and exploit the physics of dual pump dissipative Kerr soliton? And dual pump soliton has been studied for quite a while. So they have been studied either through a temporal approach, mostly understood through cross-phase modulation, which allows to understand cavity binding of the pores with a CW through a second pump. It also allows to explain some limited spectral extension up to a secondary pump in a microtoroid resonator. But also it can be explained through a spectral approach using five mixing. For instance, in this work, we have a propagating soliton with a CW pump that allows to create new type of dispersive wave. But for wave mixing, there's a lot of wave mixing. We have 4 waves, and any combination of these 4 waves is allowed in this process. But interestingly, in this work in 2013, it has been pinpointed that dispersive wave can be understood through wave mixing Bragg scattering process, which is a really particular process. So first of all, why do we call that Bragg scattering? So as everyone knows what's Bragg scattering in solid, you have an incident light that is scattered away and the condition of the wavelength which is scattered is defined by the arrangement, the periodic arrangement of the atom inside the crystal, and is basically a phase matching condition. In a nonlinear medium, especially a Chi3 nonlinear medium, we can have any type of wave mixing, but in particular, we can have Bragg scattering where the idler is equal to the signal plus or minus the delta between the pump, both in energy or frequency or in phase. And it can be understood actually as the two pump, which create a refractive index grading that is moving with the light, and has a periodicity which is equal to 2 pi over delta beta. And it is modulated actually at the beating frequency in time. So for mixing bright scattering can be understood as the signal which is scattered away from the grading created by the two pump and is scattered away at a frequency which is equal to the beating of the two pump. Therefore, it's a direct frequency conversion from the signal to the idler, where the two photon pumps are not involved in the mixing and only in the creation of this grading. And in the group, we have been interested in Fourier mixing bright scattering in different experiments. So there's two main schemes of Fourier mixing. So first of all, assuming a ring resonator with state of resonance, we can have a closed band pump Fourier mixing, where the two pumps are close to each other and the signal is far away. And a positive and a negative idler will be created where the spacing between the signal and the idler is equal to the spacing between the two main pumps. And the efficiency of such Fourier mixing bright scattering can be quite high, up to 30%. But there is another scheme where it's called an interband conversion, where the two pumps are actually far away from each other in two different bands, and the signal is close band with the first pump. And an idler will be created where the distance to the second pump will be the same as the signal in the first pump. And the efficiency can be even better, up to 60%. And to show that it's a noiseless spectral translation, an experiment has been carried in the group where we have a quantum dot inside a nanopillar that generates a single photon and is sent into a micro resonator where Fourier mixing will occur, spectrally translated the single photon at 980 into the seabed. And measuring the anti-bunching, the temporal profile of the single photon, we can see that before conversion, as it's a pure single photon from a quantum dot, we can clearly see an anti-bunching behavior. But also after conversion with a conversion efficiency of about 12%, we can clearly see the nature of the converted photon provides still a nice anti-bunching, proving that the prime photon are not converted into the output idler. And we have a direct conversion from a signal to an idler, which is noiseless. So in this talk, I'm going to provide you with a framework of Fourier mixing bright scattering in the case where we already have a dissipative Kerr soliton, where the second pump will act as a spectral translator. I will show you experimental demonstration of such ultra-broadband comp, and I will discuss and provide some experiments that let us believe that such comp can be used for metrology. So first of all, I'm going to present you some basic equation to explain the Fourier mixing bright scattering with this Kerr soliton, and bear with me, there will be only equation there, and I will have a graphical explanation in the slide following. So first of all, let's assume conservation of momentum and energy. In a resonator, it's directly translated into frequency and mode number conversion. Assuming Fourier mixing bright scattering, which is idler equals C null plus or minus the delta between the pumps, it means that we have conservation of frequency and mode number. And here we make the assumption that the primary pump, PP, generates a primary dissipative Kerr soliton, omega p DKS, on a fixed grid defined by D1. We introduce a secondary pump, which is on resonance, therefore is not on a fixed grid determined by D1, which allows for spectral translation of the dissipative Kerr soliton onto idler. This idler being on a fixed grid relative to the secondary pump. That means we can rewrite all the different frequency of interest based on the primary pump, the mode number, and the integrity dispersion. Here also we are making the change of notation such that the signal will be defined as PDKS for primary dissipative Kerr soliton, and the idler will be defined as SDKS for spectrally translated dissipative Kerr soliton. So rewriting this frequency into the energy conservation, let us have two sets of conditions. The first one for the negative idler, which is an idler at lower frequency than the signal. Let's know that the frequency matching of the energy conservation is simply that the integrity dispersion at the idler must be the same as the integrity dispersion at the secondary pump. And that the spacing between the idler and the secondary pump must be the same between the signal or the primary DKS disk and the primary. But we also have another idler, which is a positive idler, therefore an idler at higher frequency than the signal. The energy conservation is also quite simple, and it's almost the same. That means the integration needs to be the same, as the difference that it needs to be a change of sign. And the mode matching and the momentum conservation is such that the idler and the primary pump needs to have the same spacing as the signal or the primary DKS teeth and the secondary pump. So all that can be explained graphically in the same fashion as the integrity dispersion and the zero crossing can describe where the dispersive wave of a single pump dissipative Kerr soliton will occur. So here we introduce our secondary pump at longer wavelengths than our primary pump. So here as we say, we assume that any comb teeth can act as a signal. And if we assume the negative idler first, which means that the spacing between the primary pump and the signal, therefore any comb teeth, will determine the maximum spacing between the secondary pump and the idler. That means that all this region here will be forbidden for phase matching. So we will not consider any of this region. So first of all, let's consider a small delta mu. So we take a comb tooth that is not far away from the primary pump. And if we look at like 4 modes away from the secondary pump, the integrity dispersion is almost the same, and actually is still within 1/9 width. But because it's not exactly the same, the foreign mixing brass scattering will be not very effective. We can consider another comb line, which here is spacing which is -2. The integrity dispersion is a bit better, it's a bit closer to the secondary pump one, so the efficiency will be slightly better. And if we consider every comb teeth close to the pump, we can see that we have a spectral translation of all these comb teeth around the secondary pump. But thanks to the higher order dispersion, we have a roll-off of the integrity dispersion where a perfect frequency matching can occur, which means that we have a mode that exhibits exactly the same integrity dispersion than the secondary pump. Therefore, if we find a comb tooth that has the same spacing between these two modes, we know that this will be the signal of our foreign mixing brass scattering. And because the frequency matching is perfectly made, and mode matching also, we have a really efficient foreign mixing brass scattering phenomenon occurring, which creates a new dispersive wave at long wavelengths. Now we can consider the positive idler, which means an idler at a higher frequency than the signal. In the same fashion that we have seen before, we actually have also a forbidden region for phase matching. That means we will not consider any possibility at these frequencies. Here, pretty easily, we can see that we have an integrity dispersion. We have a mode at an integrity dispersion, which is equal to integrity dispersion at the secondary pump, just with a change of sign. Therefore, perfect frequency matching will occur, and efficient foreign mixing brass scattering will occur too, creating a new dispersive wave. Interestingly, we can see that we have a perfect frequency matching, which also occur at higher wavelengths. But because we're in this forbidden area, we cannot phase match any mode there. Therefore, we will not have any dispersive wave creation. If we sum up this positive and negative idler, we can have actually 2 dispersive waves. Here we can see a Lugento Lefevre, generalized Lugento Lefevre simulation under 2 pumps, where we have extended our bandwidth up to 1.6 octave. And that allows to provide a bridge between C-band, where lies our secondary pump, and visible region, thanks to the new created dispersive waves. We move ahead and we demonstrate experimentally such ultra-broadband frequency comb. We primarily pump our resonator at 1060 nanometer and secondary pump it at 1550 nanometer. Our ring resonator is made of silicon nitride embedded in silicon dioxide, and it has been designed such that it provides a largely asymmetric integrity dispersion in the same fashion than I shown you in the theoretical slide before that. And also we engineer the coupling such that we have a pulley without any coupling resonance, providing a flat coupling with efficient extraction throughout the full bandwidth of our ultra-broadband Kerr soliton. It has been shown in many papers that using 2 lasers allow for thermal stabilization of the ring resonator, which is quite convenient in our case because we can achieve adiabatically dissipative Kerr soliton. And also, we have a set of other lasers that cover the bandwidth of our ultra-broadband Kerr soliton that allows for heterodyne bit knot measurement. So first, we investigate different states of the frequency comb. First, the primary comb near threshold, the primary comb at higher power, and a 2 soliton state. The first thing that is obvious is that the pattern in each case is spectrally translated. Looking closely, we can see that the free spectral range is actually preserved both in the primary and in the spectrally translated region. So that means the energy conservation is respected and means that we do not have two independent frequency comb where we generate a comb from the primary pump and another comb from the secondary pump, but rather have a mixing of both primary and secondary pump with the comb teeth of the primary pump, allowing for spectral translation. Looking closely at the two soliton state, we can see that we actually have a missing tooth at a mode which is -4 modes away from the primary pump. Interestingly, we also have a missing comb tooth that is 4 modes away from the secondary pump, which exhibits the foil mixing Bragg scattering nature of such process, as only foil mixing Bragg scattering will phase match such phenomenon and will not show any asymmetry in the missing tooth. And also we can simulate to generalize Ultra-Broadband fever equation such frequency comb and the pattern and reproduce the same pattern. We obtain a single dissipative Kerr soliton that is spectrally translated and covered from 140 terahertz down to the visible at 410 terahertz, which is far larger than state-of-the-art octave spanning comb, either pump at 1550 or larger octave spanning comb when it's pumped at lower wavelength, such as 1060. Our comb actually covers a bandwidth which would theoretically allow for F3F stabilization, allowing for monolithic nonlinear interferometry. In addition, the Ultra-Broadband fever can give a hint on the nature of the. First, if we can simulate a single pump dissipative Kerr soliton, where we see that the envelope is actually the same as the experimental one. Introducing a new pump, we can see that first, the primary component is not perturbed, which means the secondary pump do not perturb the pulse and only provide for spectral translation. Looking at the temporal profile, we can see that in the single pump regime, we do have a nice pulse with modulation and the tail, which correspond to the dispersive wave. And when we add the secondary pump, we can see that the pulse is mostly unchanged, but the background is increased along with its modulation, which actually is consistent with the foil mixing Bragg scattering or spectral translation, and is also consistent with state-of-the-art dissipative Kerr soliton binding that I presented earlier. So we also demonstrate that it's consistent with dispersion variation. So to do the dispersion variation, we modified our ring widths. First, we single pump different ring widths from 1080 nanometer to 1125, and we can see that the dispersive wave is shifted as expected as the integrity dispersion is modified. By dual pumping such ring resonator, we can experimentally see that the primary portion is totally unchanged compared to the single pump case, which comforts our idea that we have seen theoretically through the Ultra-Broadband fever equation. And in addition, we can see that the dispersive wave is shifted from the foil mixing Bragg scattering, which is consistent with the integrity dispersion shift due to the ring width variation. Also, we can experimentally demonstrate that we have an increase of the bandwidth which is larger than 2.5. So I've demonstrated that we can get a very, very broad dissipative Kerr soliton. But most importantly is this comb useful for metrology. And one of the criteria to have a useful comb for metrology is that all the comb teeth needs to be fully determined. And usually in dissipative Kerr soliton, it's fully determined through their mode number, through the repetition rate, and through the carrier envelope offset. Looking at our frequency comb, we can definitely measure the repetition rate. We could potentially measure the carrier envelope offset. But looking closer, we do have like a weird behavior in the overlap region between the primary and the translated portion. And we actually do have stitching between the primary portion and the translated portion, which we characterize as this frequency overlap offset delta F. So are we in the presence of a dual comb with two different repetition rates, or is it the same frequency comb? So first we measure bit notes in both portions to make sure that both of them are actually part of a pulse, which is consistent with the heterodyne measurement that we provide here. So we go ahead and we actually measure the repetition rate of both portions with different ring widths. So we measure first the primary portion, and then we measure the translated portion, and we can see that they are exactly the same. Therefore, the entity within the ring are moving at the same speed, and it's not two poles that are separated and moving at different speed within the resonator. Interestingly, it's slightly different from the linear free spectral range at the primary pump due to the higher order dispersion coefficient. So that means we have the repetition rate which is conserved throughout the bandwidth, and that's consistent with 4F mixing brass scattering as it has energy conservation. So we still have this frequency overlap offset delta F. But it's interesting to remember that the integrity dispersion actually measures the discrepancy between the frequency of resonance and the comb teeth frequency of a dissipative Kerr soliton. And if you remember, one of the assumptions that we made here was that the secondary pump was on resonance. It has to be on resonance. It has to be within the ring to allow for 4F mixing brass scattering, which means it's not on the fixed grid determined by the dissipative Kerr soliton, but rather shifted by the value of the integrity dispersion at the secondary pump. And if we plot the expected theoretical value of the integrity dispersion at the secondary pump, we can see that they match quite well with the measured value of the frequency overlap offset. We have a small discrepancy that we believe is due to the geometrical variation that is not accounted in the simulation, and we simulate a perfect ring here. So interestingly, we show that we have a fixed repetition rate. Therefore, the frequency overlap is the same for each comb teeth, and it's totally predictable through the integrity dispersion at the secondary pump. So now we have a fully known set of frequencies defined by the repetition rate, which is fixed throughout the bandwidth, the carrier envelope offset, and this new parameter that we just introduced, which is fully determined by the integrity dispersion, which is the frequency overlap offset. But the other condition for a useful metrology comb is that all the comb teeth have a fixed phase relationship between each other. So the first thing that we make sure is that each comb teeth individually actually provide a low phase noise state. And to do so, we measure with an heterodyne bit knot, where we bring another laser close to the comb tooth and measure the bit knot. So we do that in the primary portion, which is expected to show low noise as it's a dissipative Kerr soliton. But we also provide bit knot measurement in the spectrally translated region, and we actually see that we have exactly the same type of behavior, showing that the spectrally translated portion preserves the low noise state. However, it does not provide any information on the noise between each portion. Therefore, this portion is low noise, this portion is low noise, but we do not know the interplay noise. And to measure it, actually, we focus on the overlap region, where here we have one comb tooth from the primary portion, and we have one comb tooth from the spectrally translated, separated by the frequency overlap offset, delta F. And we use a neocomb at 1300 nanometer generated by two phase modulators that cover a bandwidth larger than the frequency overlap offset, delta F. And by using the EO comb and matching the comb teeth of the EO comb on the same side of the dissipative Kerr soliton, we can measure the bit knots. And we will obtain two bit knots for each comb tooth, one from the primary component, one from the translated component. And each bit knot will be composed of the dissipative Kerr soliton phase noise, but also the 1300 laser phase noise. And actually, our 1300 laser is not that great. So we get this really large phase noise measurement here. But interestingly, because we have the bit knot which is both on each side, if we mix these two bit knots together and we do the math of the different signal, we actually totally suppress the phase noise of the 1300 laser, the contribution of the 1300 laser. And we only provide a frequency down conversion of the bit knot between the two comb teeth. So we actually will measure the bit knot between a comb tooth from the translated portion and the comb tooth of the primary portion that is frequency down converted to a bandwidth which we can measure. And by measuring this, we actually demonstrate that it's a really narrow bit knot, showing that the interplay between the primary the primary portion and the spectrally translation portion is actually low noise. In conclusion, I have demonstrated a spectrally translated dissipative Kerr soliton covering a bandwidth allowing for F to F down to the visible through foil mixing brass scattering, which is a noiseless spectral translation. I have demonstrated a theoretical framework for a complete prediction of this new dispersive wave generation, which would allow to engineer and design such new kind of frequency comp. I also talk about potential use for metrology application. So I introduced a new parameter that we will have to know and measure to fully stabilize this kind of frequency comp, which is a frequency overlap offset that is entirely predictable through the integrity dispersion value at the second diagonal, and also through measurement, through noise measurement of each portion, and in between the portion, we have demonstrated that this dissipative Kerr soliton is low noise and we believe can be used for metrology application. And I would like to thank all the people in Cardiac's group that have contributed to this work, and Jan Chambo from UMD that also have helped us understood such new kind of frequency comp. And if you have any question, please feel free to reach out in any way you can. Thank you.